Dr. Hartley stood beside Eleanor's body, with the expression of a man who had anticipated this outcome, far more than his professional manner allowed him to acknowledge, his fingers moving automatically through the motions of confirming what his eyes had already registered with unmistakable clarity. The village constable, a good-natured man named Whitmore, who had served Little Mortham for 20 years with more concern for preventing mischief than investigating genuine crime, was already telephoning the county police from Margaret Ashford's office, his voice carrying the peculiar formality that men adopt when speaking to superiors about matters beyond their ordinary jurisdiction. Miss Marple settled herself with a small cup of tea, which Margaret had pressed into her hands despite the chaos, and observed the scene with the calm of someone watching a familiar pattern repeat itself with new variations. The ladies remained in the tea-rooms themselves, none having been dismissed, all having been requested to remain by Constable Whitmore, though his request had possessed the uncertain quality of a man unsure whether he possessed the authority to detain them and hoping his uniform would suffice in place of genuine legal standing. Victoria Blackwood sat very still in one of the chairs near the window, the orange peel no longer in her possession, though Miss Marple noted with interest that Victoria's gaze kept returning to the empty space on the table, as if she might expect the fruit skin to reconstitute itself through sheer force of attention. Dr. Hartley's wife Susan had moved to sit beside Eleanor's niece, offering the kind of sympathetic murmurs that young women of breeding offer each other in circumstances that call for feminine solidarity, though the sympathy seemed somewhat automatic, delivered with the same dutiful attention Susan gave to all her social obligations. Dorothy Hewitt had folded her needlework and placed it carefully in her bag, her hands trembling slightly as she performed this small task, and her lips had taken on that particularly thin appearance they assumed whenever she was confronted with circumstances that demanded she acknowledge the existence of human weakness or moral ambiguity. Charlotte Ames, the schoolmistress, had opened a small notebook with the unconscious gesture of someone accustomed to recording observations, and she was writing rapidly, her dark eyes glancing periodically at each of her companions, as if comparing their physical reactions to some mental checklist of expected human responses. Rose Pemberton had begun knitting again, her needles clicking with the desperate regularity of prayer beads being worked through a rosary, her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles at the hinge stood out in sharp relief against her pale skin. Margaret Ashford moved between her customers and the kitchen with the mechanical precision of shock, bringing fresh water that no one requested and removing cups that no one had emptied, her mind clearly still engaged in the moment Eleanor had stumbled, as if she might, through repetition, somehow alter the outcome that had already been sealed. When Inspector Bradshaw arrived from the county town some 40 minutes later, accompanied by a younger constable with the fresh-faced appearance of someone still early in his career, the atmosphere of the tea-rooms had taken on the quality of a funeral parlor, though Eleanor's body had already been removed to a more appropriate location. Inspector Bradshaw was a tall man in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that suggested he had seen enough of human wickedness to approach fresh crimes with methodical detachment rather than theatrical outrage. He established himself in Margaret's private sitting room and began his preliminary interviews with the air of a man following a well-worn path, his questions professional but lacking the particular incisiveness that suggested he anticipated the case would prove complicated. It was precisely this assumption, Miss Marple reflected, as she watched him conduct his interviews through the open doorway, that would lead him astray, for Inspector Bradshaw clearly entertained the comforting belief that Eleanor Blackwood had either consumed something poisoned by accident or had perhaps poisoned herself, a conclusion that was comforting in its simplicity and its promise of swift resolution. The post-mortem examination, which Dr. Hartley performed at the county hospital with the assistance of a toxicologist brought from the city, revealed that Eleanor had indeed been poisoned, the poison being identified as arsenic, administered in a dose substantial enough that it could not possibly be explained as accidental contamination. This revelation transformed what Constable Whitmore might have dismissed as natural causes into what Inspector Bradshaw could not avoid acknowledging as murder. a word that seemed to lodge uncomfortably in his throat as he announced it, as if the very utterance of it in connection with a respected widow of the village constituted some sort of social transgression. The question of how the arsenic had been administered proved surprisingly straightforward, for Eleanor had consumed nothing at the tea-rooms except the tea itself and a single petit four, and Margaret Ashford's assistant had prepared both items under circumstances that seemed to preclude tampering. This left only the orange, which Eleanor herself had not eaten but which Victoria had been peeling, a fact that Inspector Bradshaw seized upon with the relief of a man who had found the first handhold in what might otherwise prove to be a difficult climb. Miss Marple, observing from her position in the corner of the tea-rooms, noted that Victoria's expression did not reflect the fear or indignation that someone innocent of such a charge might display, but rather a kind of weary resignation, as if she had long anticipated that circumstances would eventually contrive to place suspicion upon her, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. It was this expression, more than any evidence, that caused Miss Marple to begin the slow, careful process of examination that would eventually lead not to the easy conclusion that Inspector Bradshaw seemed prepared to embrace, but rather to a truth far more complex and considerably darker than a simple case of poisoning by a jealous or resentful relative. The village had settled into evening by the time the preliminary investigation concluded, the autumn darkness falling with the swift finality that presages winter, and Miss Marple walked home through the quiet streets of Little Mortham with her mind engaged in that particular kind of observation that had served her so well throughout her long and unconventional life, noting not just the facts that the official investigation had catalogued, but rather the small, infinitesimal reactions of each person involved, the subtle shifts in composure, the momentary flickers of expression that revealed far more than any confession might accomplish. The morning after Eleanor Blackwood's death broke grey and cold over Little Mortham, the kind of autumn morning that seemed to carry the weight of impending winter in its very air, and the village had transformed overnight into something resembling a theatrical stage where every interaction had become fraught with the kind of significance that only murder could impart. The constable's office had been relocated temporarily to the village hall, and Inspector Bradshaw had established what amounted to a command centre in the largest meeting room, with statements being taken from anyone who had been present at the tea-rooms and with systematic interviews being arranged for those whose connection to Eleanor Blackwood required clarification. By mid-morning, the entire village seemed to exist in a state of anxious speculation, with conversations in the post office and the butcher's shop taking on the quality of amateur detective work, each participant offering their own theories about Victoria Blackwood's motive, her opportunity, and her apparent guilt. Mrs. Hewitt, the vicar's wife, had been particularly vocal in her pronouncements, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had always found something suspicious about Victoria, that a woman of her age appearing suddenly in the village with such scant explanation could hardly be trusted, and that Eleanor had been far too trusting of relatives who appeared to take advantage of her considerable wealth and her evident loneliness. This narrative had proven remarkably persuasive, for Victoria had indeed been living in Eleanor's house, had indeed been the sole beneficiary named in Eleanor's will, a fact that had emerged during the preliminary stages of the investigation with the inevitability of dominoes falling in sequence. Yet it was precisely this obviousness that gave Miss Marple pause as she sat in her small parlour with her knitting, her needles moving in the practised rhythm that allowed her mind to work unimpeded by the necessity of conscious thought. She had arranged to meet with Inspector Bradshaw that afternoon, a meeting that had been initiated by Constable Whitmore, who maintained a respectful awareness of Miss Marple's unofficial but widely acknowledged expertise in matters of a criminal nature. The inspector had been initially skeptical of the old woman's involvement, viewing her as merely another village busybody seeking relevance through proximate. Why to dramatic events? But his skepticism had gradually transformed into a kind of grudging respect when Miss Marple had asked 3 questions that had immediately illuminated gaps in his preliminary investigation. The first question concerned the orange itself, for Miss Marple had observed that while an orange could indeed be poisoned, the process would require the poison to be introduced into the fruit before the peel was removed. a circumstance that would necessitate either access to the orange before Victoria had obtained it, or the presence of the poison within the fruit from the moment of purchase. The second question pertained to Eleanor's symptoms, for Miss Marple had noted that the onset of Eleanor's illness had been remarkably sudden, and the progression toward death had been extraordinarily swift, suggesting a poison that worked with almost theatrical efficiency rather than the insidious accumulation that arsenic typically demonstrated. The third question, and the one that had caused Inspector Bradshaw to set down his pen and regard Miss Marple with something approaching actual interest, concerned Victoria's behavior during and after the incident, for Miss Marple had observed that Victoria's expression when Eleanor collapsed had not reflected the shock that one might expect from someone guilty of such a crime, but rather something that resembled confirmation, as if Victoria had been anticipating precisely what occurred. Inspector Bradshaw had therefore begun to expand his investigation beyond the obvious conclusion, interviewing not only Victoria but also Margaret Ashford and her assistant, examining the sources from which the tea and petit fours had been obtained, and investigating Eleanor's relationships within the village more thoroughly than his initial assumptions had required. What emerged from these expanded inquiries was a picture of Eleanor Blackwood, considerably more complex than the simple portrait of a wealthy widow had initially suggested. Eleanor had been, by all accounts, a woman of considerable acuity and some hardness of character, a woman who had accumulated her wealth not merely through the fortuitous marriage that had produced it, but through shrewd management and calculated decisions made both before and after her husband's death 20 years prior. She had also been a woman with secrets, connections, and influences that extended throughout the village in ways that not everyone had fully appreciated. Her relationship with her niece Victoria, upon closer examination, revealed itself to be considerably more fraught than the simple arrangement of a wealthy aunt providing shelter to a displaced relative might suggest. Victoria's arrival in Little Mortham had not, in fact, been precipitated by mere family affection or generalized need, but rather by a specific set of circumstances that Victoria had kept carefully hidden from village observation. 3 years prior, Victoria had been engaged to marry a man named Charles Pemberton, who worked as a solicitor in London, an engagement that had ended under circumstances that society preferred not to discuss, but which involved allegations of impropriety that had cast sufficient shadow over Victoria's reputation that marriage prospects had become severely limited. Eleanor, who had maintained distant but regular correspondence with Victoria's mother, had written to her niece offering the security of her home and the protection of her name, understanding that in a village where she possessed both wealth and long-standing social position, a woman could establish or re-establish herself under the umbrella of family connection, regardless of whispered scandals attached to her past. What was particularly interesting, from Miss Marple's perspective, was that Charles Pemberton was related to Rose Pemberton, the vicar's housekeeper, a connection that had not initially seemed significant, but which, upon investigation, revealed itself to possess considerable meaning. Rose had been Charles's sister, and she had harbored considerable resentment toward Victoria for what she perceived as the humiliation that the broken engagement had caused to her brother, reputation, a resentment that had been further inflamed by Eleanor's decision to welcome Victoria, despite the scandal. Furthermore, Rose had access to the tea rooms, visited them regularly, and had been present on the afternoon of Eleanor's death, a circumstance that had initially escaped close examination simply because Rose had seemed far too minor a figure in the village hierarchy to warrant serious consideration as a suspect. It was this observation, subtle and easily overlooked, that caused Miss Marple to begin examining the events of Eleanor's final afternoon with considerably greater attention to the movements and positions of everyone involved, rather than fixating upon the most obvious suspect. And it was this examination that would eventually illuminate the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of Little Mortham's seemingly placid existence. The investigation had now been underway for 3 days, and the initial certainty that had surrounded Victoria Blackwood's guilt had begun to erode at the edges, like a watercolor painting left too long in the rain, though Inspector Bradshaw seemed reluctant to acknowledge this erosion with any enthusiasm. He had questioned Victoria exhaustively, searching for cracks in her narrative, but Victoria had maintained her composure with a kind of weary acceptance that suggested she had expected precisely this treatment and had made peace with it long before the murder had occurred. Her account of the afternoon remained consistent. She had purchased the orange from the greengrocer on High Street that very morning, had kept it in her handbag until arriving at the tea rooms, had begun peeling it while engaged in conversation, and had not, at any point, done anything that might constitute poisoning or harm to her aunt. Moreover, the greengrocer, a meticulous man named Mr. Hutchins, who maintained detailed records of his produce deliveries, had confirmed that the oranges he had sold that morning had come from a wholesaler in the neighboring county, the same wholesaler that supplied produce to restaurants and hotels throughout the region, making it virtually impossible to determine when, if ever, the orange had been tampered with. The post-mortem examination had also raised questions that had not initially been addressed, for the toxicologist had noted that while arsenic had definitely caused Eleanor's death, the concentration and distribution of the poison suggested something rather unusual about the manner of its administration. Arsenic, when consumed orally, typically produces symptoms that develop gradually over hours or even days, the victim experiencing progressive weakness, gastrointestinal distress, and ultimately collapse. Eleanor, by contrast, had experienced a sudden onset of symptoms, a rapid progression toward unconsciousness, and death within what could not have been more than 20 minutes of her first complaints. This rapidity of effect suggested a poison administered in exceptional concentration, or perhaps a poison that was not arsenic at all, but something that had been mistakenly identified as such, a possibility that had prompted the toxicologist to conduct more rigorous testing, ultimately confirming that the substance was indeed arsenic, but present in Eleanor's system in quantities that suggested an exceptionally large dose. Miss Marple had attended one of Inspector Bradshaw's interviews with Vi. Victoria, positioned in the background with a kind of unobtrusive presence that she had perfected over decades of observation, and she had noted something that she suspected the inspector had missed entirely. When the inspector had asked Victoria about her relationship with Eleanor, particularly about Eleanor's feelings regarding Victoria's arrival in the village and the scandal that had preceded it, Victoria's expression had shifted in a manner that suggested not guilt, but rather a kind of profound sadness, combined with what appeared to be genuine uncertainty about her aunt's true feelings. Victoria had described Eleanor as kind, as generous, as accepting of her situation without judgment, yet there had been something in the hesitation with which Victoria had offered these descriptions that suggested layers of complexity beneath the surface narrative. Miss Marple had seen that particular expression before, had recognized it as the look of someone who suspected that they had not been understood by those they cared for, that their deepest intentions and feelings had been misinterpreted or completely missed by the recipient of their affection. Following the interview, Miss Marple had requested a brief private conversation with Victoria, a request that Inspector Bradshaw had granted with the air of a man humoring an elderly woman's eccentricities. The two women had sat together in the small room at the village hall where preliminary interviews were being conducted, Victoria sitting rigidly in her chair with the controlled tension of someone bracing for attack, while Miss Marple had settled herself with the comfort of someone for whom all situations seemed equally manageable. Miss Marple had not asked about the poison, had not questioned Victoria's movements, had not attempted to establish motive or opportunity. Instead, she had asked Victoria about her childhood, about H.E.R. relationship with her mother, about the circumstances that had led to her engagement to Charles Pemberton, and the reasons that engagement had failed. Victoria had answered with the hesitant quality of someone unaccustomed to sharing such intimate details, but as she had spoken, her posture had gradually relaxed, and her expression had transformed from defensive rigidity into something resembling relief. What emerged from this conversation was a portrait of a young woman who had spent her life attempting to please others, to meet expectations that had been placed upon her by family and society, to conform to standards of propriety and behavior that had ultimately proven impossible to maintain. The engagement to Charles Pemberton had ended not because of Victoria's misbehavior, but because Charles had become involved with a woman of dubious reputation, and when the scandal had become public, Victoria had been blamed for the association, though she had been entirely innocent. Eleanor, Victoria had explained, had written to her offering unconditional shelter. But Eleanor had also warned Victoria that village life would prove suffocating, that she would encounter considerable judgment, and that she would need to develop strength of character to withstand the weight of other people's assumptions and prejudices. Victoria had attempted to do precisely that, had attempted to rebuild her reputation and establish herself within Little Mortham's social structure. And from all available evidence, she had been making steady progress in this regard. Yet, as Miss Marple had listened to Victoria's account, she had become increasingly aware that Eleanor's warnings about village judgment had proven prophetic, and that Victoria herself had become the convenient repository for all the suspicion and resentment that the village had generated following the murder. After Victoria had departed, Miss Marple had sat alone in the small room and had begun the process of reconsidering the entire sequence of events that had preceded Eleanor's death. She had thought about Rose Pemberton and her connection to Charles, about Dorothy Hewitt's pronounced hostility toward Victoria, about Margaret Ashford's nervous movements throughout the afternoon, and about the peculiar circumstance that almost everyone present at the tea-rooms had possessed some form of resentment toward Eleanor Blackwood herself. This recognition had prompted a radical revision of Miss Marple's approach to the investigation, for she had begun to suspect that the poisoning of Eleanor might not have been motivated by hostility toward Victoria at all, but rather by something far more personal and considerably more dangerous that had been hidden beneath layers of village propriety and social convention. Miss Marple's reconsideration of the evidence had begun with a return to first principles, a methodology that had served her exceptionally well throughout her long involvement in matters of crime and human nature. She had requested from Inspector Bradshaw access to the statements that had been taken from all individuals present at the tea-rooms, and she had spent the better part of the evening reviewing them with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested she was searching for something far more subtle than contradictions in narrative or obvious inconsistencies in testimony. What had struck her with increasing force was not what the statements contained, but rather what they revealed about the relationships that connected the various women present at the tea-rooms on the afternoon of Eleanor's death. Margaret Ashford's statement had been notably careful, almost defensive in its precision, detailing every action she had taken throughout the afternoon with the kind of specificity that suggested she'd as attempting to establish an alibi for actions she had not actually been suspected of performing. This overcompensation, in Miss Marple's experience, typically indicated either consciousness of guilt or profound anxiety about some other matter entirely unrelated to the murder, but which the speaker feared might be discovered during investigation. Susan Hartley's statement had been curiously vague regarding her movements and attention during the critical moments immediately preceding Eleanor's collapse. Vagueness that seemed inconsistent with Susan's general character, which Miss Marple knew from village observation to be orderly and precise. Charlotte Ames, the schoolmistress, had recorded in her notebook precise times and observations, yet upon review, Miss Marple had noticed that Charlotte's observations regarding Victoria's movements had been remarkably detailed, while her observations of everyone else present had been considerably more general and less specific. Dorothy Hewitt's statement had been characterized by a kind of moral certainty regarding Victoria's guilt that seemed premature, given that the investigation had at that point produced no conclusive evidence, and this certainty had carried with it an edge of righteousness that Miss Marple recognized as the hallmark of someone defending their own position rather than simply reporting observed facts. Rose Pemberton's statement had been the shortest of all, consisting of minimal information regarding her movements and activities, as if she had contributed as little as possible to the official record, yet Rose had been present, had been positioned where she could observe the proceedings, and had possessed both access and opportunity. It was this last observation that had prompted Miss Marple to undertake some independent investigation, for she had begun to wonder whether the investigation itself had been precise. Along lines that the actual perpetrator had deliberately established. On the morning of the 4th day following Eleanor's death, Miss Marple had visited the greengrocer's establishment, ostensibly to purchase vegetables, but in reality to engage Mr. Hutchins in conversation regarding his business practices and his recollection of the morning on which Victoria had purchased the orange. Mr. Hutchins had proven remarkably forthcoming, displaying the kind of pride in his business standards that made him eager to demonstrate his record-keeping and to detail the provenance of his produce. He had confirmed that, on the morning in question, he had received a delivery of oranges from his usual wholesaler, that he had processed them in his customary manner, and that he had been present in his shop throughout the morning, having served perhaps a dozen customers in addition to Victoria. Yet when Miss Marple had inquired whether any of his regular customers had made unusual purchases that morning, Mr. Hutchins had paused, and his expression had taken on a quality of careful recollection. He had recalled that Rose Pemberton had come into his shop very early that morning, before the shop had officially opened for regular trade, as she often did to select vegetables for the vicar's household. On this particular morning, she had requested several items, had spent considerably longer than usual selecting her produce, and had paid with a hastiness that suggested she had been preoccupied or anxious about something. Moreover, Rose had specifically requested arsenic, or rather, she had inquired whether Mr. Hutchins stocked any poisons suitable for eliminating rats, a request that had struck Mr. Hutchins as unusual, because Rose had previously obtained such materials from the chemist rather than the greengrocer. Mr. Hutchins had not stocked poison, had directed Rose toward the chemist B. He had remembered the interaction with sufficient clarity that he recalled it even as he discussed the subsequent orange purchase. This revelation had been sufficiently significant that Miss Marple had determined to speak with the chemist, a conversation that had required considerable delicacy, for Mr. Bowers, the chemist, was bound by professional confidentiality that prevented him from discussing his customers' purchases without legal compulsion. However, Miss Marple had approached him as a concerned fellow professional, as it were, suggesting that she was assisting Inspector Bradshaw in clarifying certain details, and she had inquired whether anyone had purchased arsenic in the days preceding Eleanor's death. Mr. Bowers had been reluctant but ultimately forthcoming, confirming that Rose Pemberton had indeed purchased a small quantity of arsenic 2 days before the murder, citing the necessity of controlling rats at the vicar's residence. This purchase had seemed entirely unremarkable at the time, a routine transaction that occurred with regularity, yet in the context of Eleanor's death and the poisoning that had followed, it assumed considerably greater significance. Armed with this information, Miss Marple had returned to the village hall and had requested another private conversation with Inspector Bradshaw, a conversation during which she had presented her observations regarding Rose Pemberton's movements and purchases with the careful quality of someone laying out evidence without yet drawing explicit conclusions. Inspector Bradshaw had listened with increasing attentiveness, his skepticism gradually transforming into something resembling active concern, and by the conclusion of the conversation, he had determined that Rose Pemberton would need to be questioned again, this time with considerably greater specificity regarding her whereabouts on the afternoon of the murder and her relationship with Eleanor Blackwood, a relationship that had so far remained largely unexamined because Rose had seemed too peripheral to the central drama to warrant serious investigation. The summons for Rose Pemberton to attend another interview at the village hall had been delivered by Constable Whitmore on the afternoon of the 4th day, and the delivery had occurred with sufficient discretion that not everyone in the village had immediately become aware of this development, though in Little Mortham, where information travelled through invisible networks of gossip and speculation, the news had spread with remarkable speed. Rose had arrived at the appointed time with the rigid composure of someone preparing for an ordeal, her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles seemed carved from stone, her hands clasped so firmly together that her knuckles had turned white with the force of her grip. Inspector Bradshaw had adopted a considerably different tone in this interview than he had employed with Victoria, his questions more direct, his demeanor less sympathetic, and his clear expectation being that Rose would provide explanations for the arsenic purchase and for certain inconsistencies in her account of her movements on the afternoon of Eleanor's death. Rose had maintained her composure through the initial questions, answering with the same minimal responses that had characterized her first interview, until Inspector Bradshaw had produced the chemist's records confirming the arsenic purchase, at which point something in Rose's expression had shifted, a kind of resignation settling across her features, as if she had known this moment would eventually arrive, and had merely been postponing its inevitability. She had confirmed the purchase of arsenic, had explained it as she had explained it to Mr. Bowers, citing a rat problem at the vicar's residence, and had maintained that the arsenic had been used for its stated purpose and had nothing whatsoever to do with Eleanor Blackwood's death. Yet when Inspector Bradshaw had pressed her regarding her movements during the critical period of the afternoon, Rose's account had become considerably less coherent, her recollection of where she had been positioned in the tea-room suddenly less clear than it had been during her initial statement, and her explanation of why she had been present at all, given that she had no particular connection to Eleanor or to any of the other women present at the gathering, had become distinctly evasive. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple, who had been observing the interview from the background as was becoming her customary role, had requested a brief private conversation with Rose, a request that Inspector Bradshaw had granted with the air of a man sufficiently intrigued by Miss Marple's methods to permit her to continue with her informal investigation. The two women had sat alone in the small interview room, and Rose had regarded Miss Marple with the kind of wariness that suggested she recognized in the old woman something far more perceptive than the gentle village busybody that casual observation might suggest. Miss Marple had not begun with accusations or with pointed questions regarding arsenic or Eleanor's death. Instead, she had asked Rose about her brother Charles, about the circumstances of his engagement to Victoria Blackwood, and about the impact that the broken engagement had had upon Charles's reputation and his prospects for future matrimonial alliance. Rose's expression had hardened at these questions, and she had answered with reluctance, confirming that Charles had been profoundly affected by the scandal, that he had left London to take a position in Scotland, that he had ultimately married a woman considerably beneath his station, and had lived a life considerably diminished from what his early prospects had suggested. Moreover, Rose had made clear through her tone and her word choice that she held Victoria responsible for Charles's disappointment and for the smaller life that he had subsequently lived, and that she had never forgiven Victoria for the humiliation and pain that the broken engagement had caused to her brother and, by extension, to Rose herself. Yet, as Miss Marple had continued with her gentle questions, probing the details of Rose's feelings and her observations of Eleanor's treatment of Victoria, something far more complex had emerged, something that went considerably deeper than mere resentment toward Victoria for her role in Charles's misfortune. Rose had gradually revealed that Eleanor had been considerably closer to Victoria than she had been to her own son, that Eleanor had favored Victoria with affection and attention that Rose had observed with increasing bitterness over the months that Victoria had been living in the village. More significantly still, Eleanor had made clear to Rose, during a conversation that had occurred approximately a week before the murder, that she had decided to alter her will, reducing the bequests to local charities, of which the church was the primary beneficiary, in order to provide Victoria with increased financial security and independence. This revelation had struck Rose with the force of a personal betrayal, not because the money had belonged to Rose in any concrete sense, but because Eleanor's decision had seemed to represent a final judgment that Victoria was worthy of love and support, while Rose herself was not. That Eleanor valued Victoria's presence and companionship more highly than she valued the traditions and institutions that Rose held dear. The arsenic purchase, Rose had eventually admitted under the gentle but relentless pressure of Miss Marple's questioning, had not been motivated by any genuine rat problem, but rather by a kind of desperate fantasy regarding the elimination of the person she had come to see as the source of her brother's diminishment and Eleanor's betrayal. However, when pressed directly regarding whether she had actually poisoned Eleanor, Rose had vehemently denied it, insisting that while she had purchased the arsenic and while she harbored considerable resentment toward both Victoria and Eleanor, she had not acted upon those feelings in any concrete manner. She had attended the tea rooms that afternoon, she had admitted, not by accident but quite deliberately, driven by an impulse she could not entirely explain, a desire perhaps to observe Victoria in her social interactions, to see whether Victoria possessed any genuine remorse or awareness of the damage she had caused. Yet she had not poisoned Eleanor, had not introduced arsenic into any food or beverage, and had not deliberately caused Eleanor's death, despite the fact that she had harbored murderous thoughts toward both Eleanor and Victoria with sufficient intensity and frequency that she could offer no defense against the accusation that she had wished them dead. This passionate denial, combined with the evident emotional turmoil that accompanied it, had created a peculiar paradox for the investigation, for while Rose clearly possessed both motive and opportunity, and while she had indeed purchased the murder weapon, nothing in her demeanor or her explanations suggested that she was the person who had actually administered the poison that had killed Eleanor Blackwood. Inspector Bradshaw found himself in the peculiar position of possessing a suspect with clear motive, verifiable opportunity, and documented access to the murder weapon, yet lacking any concrete evidence of actual guilt, a situation that lay him visibly frustrated and uncertain regarding the appropriate course of action. Rose Pemberton had been released pending further investigation, though with the clear understanding that she remained under suspicion, and the village had erupted into a frenzy of speculation regarding the significance of the arsenic purchase and the revelation that Rose harbored considerable animosity toward both Eleanor and Victoria. The narrative that had begun to crystallize in popular opinion was that Rose had murdered Eleanor out of resentment toward Victoria, that the death of Eleanor was merely a means to the end of removing Victoria's primary protector and source of financial support, a theory that was logically coherent and psychologically satisfying in its clarity. Yet Miss Marple, as she sat in her parlor on the 5th day following the murder and reviewed her notes regarding the statements and interviews, found herself increasingly convinced that this narrative, while perhaps containing elements of truth, did not constitute the complete picture of what had actually occurred on the afternoon of Eleanor's death. The critical problem, as she perceived it, was not the arsenic purchase or Rose's evident resentment, but rather the precise method by which the arsenic had been administered and the peculiar rapidity with which it had taken effect. Arsenic, when consumed orally in even substantial quantities, typically produced effects that developed gradually, beginning with gastrointestinal distress and progressing through weakness and deterioration toward eventual death, a process that might take hours or even days depending upon the quantity ingested. Eleanor's death had been remarkably swift, the onset of symptoms sudden and the progression toward unconsciousness rapid, a pattern that suggested not arsenic at all but some other poison entirely, or, alternatively, arsenic administered in a manner that produced effects far more immediately toxic than typical oral consumption would produce. It was this inconsistency that had captured Miss Marple's attention and that had prompted her to undertake some additional investigation into the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's symptoms and their manifestation. She had spoken again with Dr. Hartley, inquiring with careful delicacy regarding his exact observations of Eleanor's physical condition during those final moments before her collapse. Dr. Hartley had been somewhat reluctant to discuss the matter in detail, having already provided his observations to the official investigation, but he had eventually described Eleanor's symptoms with the precision that his medical training demanded: the sudden dizziness, the numbness in the extremities, the peculiar, frothy appearance at the lips, and the remarkable speed with which Eleanor's consciousness had deteriorated. What struck Miss Marple as particularly significant was Dr. Hartley's observation that Eleanor's lips and the tissue around her mouth had borne a faint but detectable odor of bitter almond, a characteristic scent that was typically associated with cyanide poisoning rather than arsenic poisoning, though arsenic in certain forms could sometimes produce a similar effect under particular chemical conditions. This observation had prompted Miss Marple to arrange a conversation with the toxicologist who had conducted the post-mortem examination, a conversation that had required the intervention of Inspector Bradshaw, but which had ultimately provided considerably more information than the official report had contained. The toxicologist had confirmed that the substance identified in Eleanor's body had been arsenic, but he had also noted in his preliminary examination notes which had not been included in the formal report, that the distribution and concentration of the arsenic had been unusual, suggesting that it might have been administered in a form other than simple oral consumption. Moreover, the toxicologist had observed what he had initially dismissed as contamination in Eleanor's nasal passages and respiratory tissue, a finding that he had not pursued further because it seemed inconsistent with the theory that Eleanor had been poisoned through consumption of food or beverage. Upon reconsideration, prompted by Miss Marple's specific inquiry, the toxicologist had acknowledged that if arsenic had been administered as a powder or aerosol, rather than as a liquid or solid consumed orally, the pattern of tissue damage and the distribution throughout Eleanor's body would have been entirely consistent with what he had observed. This revelation had introduced an entirely new dimension to the investigation, for it suggested that Eleanor had been poisoned not through the orange or the tea or any food or beverage, but through inhalation of a poison administered as a powder or fine mist, a method of poisoning that would have required either considerable chemical knowledge or familiarity with poisons of a specialized nature. Miss Marple had pursued this line of inquiry further, investigating whether anyone in the village possessed knowledge of chemistry or had access to materials that might be used to create an aerosol or powdered form of arsenic. Her inquiries had led her to the village schoolhouse and to Charlotte Ames, the schoolmistress, who maintained in her schoolroom a small collection of scientific equipment and chemicals for instructional purposes. Charlotte had studied chemistry at university before becoming a teacher, and she possessed both the knowledge and the access to materials that might be used to prepare arsenic in a form suitable for inhalation. Moreover, Charlotte's behavior during and after the murder took on considerable new significance when viewed through this lens, for her careful notation in her notebook might not have been the obsessive documentation of an observer, but rather the deliberate recording of details that would establish her account of events in a manner consistent with innocence. The question that remained, however, was not whether Charlotte possessed the capability to create and administer poison in such a manner, but rather what possible motive she might have harbored that would have driven her to poison Eleanor Blackwood, a woman with whom Charlotte had possessed no apparent connection beyond the casual social interaction that occurred between any inhabitants of a small village. It was this absence of apparent motive that caused Miss Marple to look more carefully at Charlotte herself, to investigate her background and her relationships within the village, and to begin to suspect that the connection between Charlotte and Eleanor might not be as incidental as it had initially appeared to be. The schoolhouse records, which Miss Marple had accessed through the polite fiction of assisting the inspector with background information regarding village residents, revealed that Charlotte Ames had been employed as the schoolmistress of Little Mortham for slightly more than 2 years, having arrived from a position at a larger school in the neighboring county under circumstances that the hiring records described merely as a personal decision to seek a quieter environment. The official account suggested nothing unusual, yet Miss Marple's inquiries regarding Charlotte's background had uncovered information considerably more complex than the straightforward narrative of a teacher seeking a rural posting suggested. Charlotte's family, upon investigation, proved to be connected to Eleanor Blackwood through a chain of relationships so attenuated that it had escaped casual notice, but which, upon careful examination, revealed itself to be remarkably significant. Charlotte's mother had been employed as a governess in a large household in the neighboring county some 30 years prior, and Eleanor Blackwood, who had been a frequent guest at that household during a period in her youth before her marriage, had apparently taken considerable interest in young Charlotte, then a child of perhaps 8 or 9 years old. Eleanor had provided financial assistance for Charlotte's education, had corresponded with Charlotte's family regarding Charlotte's progress and prospects, and had apparently entertained expectations that Charlotte would develop into a woman of considerable cultivation and accomplishment, expectations that were reflected in Eleanor's careful documentation of the financial assistance she had provided. However, when Charlotte had reached young adulthood and had begun her training as a teacher, Eleanor's interest had apparently cooled considerably, and Eleanor had gradually withdrawn her correspondence and her support, until by the time Charlotte had entered her profession, the connection between them had become practically non-existent. This withdrawal of affection and support might have constituted merely another example of Eleanor's capricious nature and her tendency to form attachments and subsequently abandon them, except for the fact that Eleanor had not simply ceased her support, but had actively discouraged Charlotte's career prospects by making disparaging remarks regarding Charlotte's capabilities and character to mutual acquaintances, remarks that had eventually reached Charlotte's ears and that had caused her considerable professional and personal damage. The evidence of this hostile activity had emerged from conversations that Miss Marple had conducted with the headmistress of the school from which Charlotte had obtained her previous position, a woman who had been somewhat reluctant to discuss Charlotte's departure, but who had eventually revealed that Eleanor Blackwood had written to the school expressing concerns regarding Charlotte's suitability for work with young people, allegations that had been vague enough to create considerable suspicion without being specific enough to justify formal investigation or remedial action. These allegations had circulated through educational circles, had created an atmosphere of doubt regarding Charlotte's professional judgment and her personal integrity, and had contributed significantly to Charlotte's decision to accept the position at the village school, a position in a smaller, more isolated community where her previous difficulties might not be known and where she might attempt to establish herself anew. The discovery of this hidden history between Charlotte and Eleanor had illuminated what had previously seemed like an absence of motive, transforming instead the entire case into one motivated not by immediate passion or recent grievance, but by the slow accumulation of resentment and the festering wound of betrayal that Eleanor had inflicted upon someone she had once appeared to value. Miss Marple had shared this discovery with Inspector Bradshaw in a conversation that had taken place in his temporary office at the village hall, and she had observed his expression transform from skeptical detachment into something resembling active concern as she had laid out the details of Eleanor's treatment of Charlotte and the effect that such treatment had produced upon Charlotte's career and reputation. Yet even with this established motive, the evidence against Charlotte remained largely circumstantial, dependent upon inference and supposition rather than upon concrete proof of her actual involvement in the murder. It was this absence of definitive evidence that had prompted Miss Marple to undertake a more direct approach to the problem, an approach that involved placing herself deliberately in proximity to Charlotte and observing how Charlotte responded to subtle inquiries designed to reveal the guilty conscience that Miss Marple suspected might be present beneath Charlotte's carefully composed exterior. The opportunity for such observation had presented itself when Miss Marple had arranged to visit the schoolhouse on a pretext of discussing the possibility of donating some educational materials to the school's library, a visit that had been received by Charlotte with the polite but guarded demeanor that she had maintained throughout the investigation. During the course of their conversation, Miss Marple had gradually introduced the subject of Eleanor Blackwood, mentioning her death with the kind of gentle sadness that befitted the loss of a respected member of the community, and had observed Charlotte's reaction with the kind of meticulous attention that had served her so effectively throughout her years of criminal investigation. Charlotte's response had been notable primarily for its restraint and its careful avoidance of any emotional expression that might betray her true feelings, yet it was precisely this restraint that had revealed far more than any passionate outburst might have accomplished. Charlotte had spoken of Eleanor with the kind of formal civility that one might employ toward an acquaintance one had never actually known, or toward someone for whom one harbored no genuine feeling, a formality that seemed inconsistent with the gratitude or respect that one might expect someone to express toward a person who had provided financial assistance during one's education. Moreover, when Miss Marple had mentioned the discovery of Eleanor's letter to Charlotte's previous employer, Charlotte's composure had fractured for just a moment, a brief flicker of something that might have been anger or perhaps vindication crossing her features before she had regained control of her expression. It was this moment of lost composure that had convinced Miss Marple that she had identified the correct suspect, yet she had also recognized that the evidence would need to be considerably more concrete than mere observation of emotional reactions if it was to convince either Inspector Bradshaw or a court of law that Charlotte had indeed administered the poison that had killed Eleanor Blackwood on that fatal afternoon at the tea rooms. The challenge that confronted Miss Marple was one that had occupied her thinking throughout the 6th and 7th days following Eleanor's murder. A challenge that transcended the mere identification of the guilty party and extended into the considerably more complex realm of establishing proof that would satisfy the requirements of law and professional investigation. She possessed motive, she possessed opportunity, and she possessed the technical knowledge necessary to prepare arsenic in a form suitable for inhalation, yet she lacked the concrete evidence that would constitute proof beyond reasonable doubt. It was this absence of definitive proof that had caused her to arrange a meeting with Inspector Bradshaw in which she had proposed a course of action that was perhaps somewhat unconventional, but which she believed might produce the evidence that the investigation lacked. The proposal had involved a carefully orchestrated social gathering at the tea rooms, ostensibly a memorial gathering for Eleanor, organized by her surviving friends and acquaintances, at which Charlotte would be invited to attend alongside the other women who had been present on the afternoon of the murder. During this gathering, Miss Marple had suggested they might observe how Charlotte responded to specific conversational prompts and environmental stimuli, prompts that had been designed to trigger particular emotional or psychological reactions that might reveal her guilt. Inspector Bradshaw had been initially reluctant to engage in what he perceived as an amateur theatrical production, yet he had ultimately accepted the proposal, understanding that the investigation had reached a point at which conventional investigative methods were producing insufficient results. The memorial gathering had been arranged for the afternoon of the 8th day following Eleanor's death, a timing that was sufficiently removed from the murder itself to allow initial suspicions to settle somewhat, but which remained close enough to maintain the emotional immediacy of the crime. Margaret Ashford had agreed to host the gathering at her tea rooms, the very location where Eleanor had died, a choice that had struck some observers as callous, but which Miss Marple had specifically requested, understanding that the weight of the location itself might contribute to the psychological pressure that she intended to place upon Charlotte. The gathering had been attended by all the women who had been present at the original tea party, each invited under the pretext of participating in a group discussion regarding the circumstances of Eleanor's death and the impact that the murder had produced upon the village community. The conversation had been carefully guided by Miss Marple, who had assumed the informal role of moderator despite her ostensibly incidental presence, steering the discussion in directions that had gradually become more pointed and more directly accusatory regarding the various suspects and their potential involvement in Eleanor's death. Dorothy Hewitt had reiterated her conviction regarding Victoria's guilt, speaking with the kind of certainty that seemed to reflect more personal hostility than objective assessment, while Susan Hartley had remained largely silent, her expression carefully neutral, contributing little beyond occasional murmurs of agreement or sympathy. Margaret Ashford had demonstrated considerable nervousness throughout the gathering, fidgeting with her apron and making frequent excuses to attend to the refreshments, activities that seemed designed to avoid sustained participation in the conversation. Victoria herself had attended with the kind of quiet resignation that had characterized her behavior since the investigation had begun, responding to accusations and insinuations with a kind of weary acceptance that suggested she had become accustomed to bearing the burden of suspicion. Yet it was Charlotte's behavior that had attracted Miss Marple's most careful attention, for Charlotte had initially maintained her characteristic composure, offering measured responses to the various accusations and theories that had emerged throughout the conversation. However, as the afternoon had progressed, and as Miss Marple had gradually introduced specific details regarding Eleanor's past behavior, particularly regarding her treatment of individuals she had initially favored but subsequently abandoned, Charlotte's composure had begun to show signs of strain. Miss Marple had deliberately mentioned the letter that Eleanor had written to Charlotte's previous employer, had quoted certain passages that had been designed to illustrate the viciousness of Eleanor's attack upon Charlotte's character and professional capabilities, and had observed how Charlotte's hands had begun to tremble as she gripped her teacup, how her breathing had become slightly more rapid, how her jaw had clenched with the effort of maintaining her outward control. The crucial moment had arrived when Miss Marple had observed that the preparation of aerosol poisons was considerably more complex than most people imagined, and that such preparation would require not only chemical knowledge, but also access to specialized equipment and materials that would be difficult to obtain without leaving some record or trace. She had suggested that the murderer had likely planned the crime with considerable premeditation, that the decision to commit murder had been made well in advance of the actual poisoning, and that Eleanor's death had been the culmination of months or perhaps years of accumulated resentment and careful planning. It was at this point that Charlotte had risen abruptly from her chair, her composed exterior finally cracking beneath the weight of Miss Marple's relentless psychological pressure, and she had left the tea-rooms without, offering any explanation or farewell. The dramatic nature of Charlotte's departure had not constituted proof of guilt, but it had certainly provided sufficient evidence to justify the questioning that Inspector Bradshaw had subsequently undertaken, questioning that had eventually led to Charlotte's confession. The confession had not come immediately, had not been offered willingly, but had emerged gradually, as Inspector Bradshaw had confronted Charlotte with the accumulated evidence that Miss Marple had assembled regarding her motives, her capabilities, and her access to the materials necessary to commit the crime. Charlotte had eventually admitted to the murder, though her motivation had proven somewhat more complex than simple revenge for Eleanor's betrayal, involving instead a twisted sense of justice regarding Eleanor's pattern of abandoning vulnerable people once they had served their purpose, a pattern that Charlotte had believed extended beyond herself and that posed a threat to others, particularly to Victoria Blackwood, who seemed destined to experience the same betrayal that Charlotte had suffered. The confession, while providing the legal and procedural closure that the investigation had required, had not constituted the final chapter in the mystery, for there remained the matter of explaining to the village and to the various individuals whose lives had been disrupted by Eleanor's death precisely what had occurred and why someone of Charlotte's apparent respectability and professional standing had committed an act of murder. Inspector Bradshaw had arranged for a formal statement to be released to the village, a statement that detailed the evidence that had led to Charlotte's arrest and that explained, in terms sufficiently clinical to avoid excessive sensationalism, the circumstances that had motivated her to poison Eleanor Blackwood. The release of this star Temen had produced considerable shock throughout Little Mortham, for Charlotte had occupied a position of considerable trust within the community, had been respected as an educator and as a woman of learning, and the revelation that she had committed murder had seemed to many observers to represent an incomprehensible betrayal of the trust that the village had placed in her. The various theories that had circulated regarding the murder's motivation, the supposition that Victoria had poisoned Eleanor for financial gain, the suspicion that Rose Pemberton had committed the murder out of resentment toward Victoria, all of these had seemed far more comprehensible than the actual truth, which was that Eleanor had been murdered by a woman she had once helped and subsequently abandoned, murdered as an act of what Charlotte had termed justice, but which was more accurately understood as a warped form of revenge that had festered throughout years of professional setbacks and personal humiliation. Miss Marple had been requested to provide a more detailed explanation of the case to Inspector Bradshaw, an explanation that would form the basis of the official report, and that would articulate the reasoning that had led her to identify Charlotte as the guilty party. In the course of providing this explanation, Miss Marple had demonstrated how the investigation had initially proceeded along lines established by the most obvious suspects, how Rose Pemberton's arsenic purchase and her evident resentment had seemingly pointed to her guilt, and how Victoria's position as Eleanor's beneficiary had created an appearance of motive that was entirely superficial. She had explained how the careful observation of human behavior and the recognition of patterns that repeated themselves throughout the village society had led her to perceive that Charlotte possessed both motivation and capability. How the deliberate psychological pressure that had been applied during the memorial gathering had produced the crack in Charlotte's composure that had ultimately led to her confession. Yet, in providing this explanation, Miss Marple had also articulated something considerably more complex and considerably more troubling than a simple account of criminal investigation and the identification of a murderer. She had observed that Eleanor Blackwood's murder was not primarily the result of any single individual's depravity or moral corruption. but rather the culmination of a pattern of behavior that Eleanor had repeated throughout her life, a pattern of forming attachments with individuals who seemed promising or deserving, providing them with assistance and support, and subsequently withdrawing that support with a kind of casual cruelty that had seemed to Eleanor merely a reasonable response to disappointment, but which had produced in her victims a wound that had festered throughout years. Eleanor had apparently possessed considerable capacity for forming judgments regarding the worth and promise of others, but she had lacked any corresponding capacity for acknowledging the human cost of her judgments when those judgments proved mistaken, or when her assessment of someone's character changed. Charlotte's crime had been the result of this pattern, had been the direct consequence of Eleanor's decision to withdraw her support and subsequently to actively undermine Charlotte's career prospects through deliberate character assassination disguised as concerned communication. The poison that Charlotte had administered had not appeared in the orange or the tea, but rather had been prepared as a fine powder that had been stored in a small vial and that had been released into the air near Eleanor's location through the use of a small mechanical device that Charlotte had constructed. Using materials from her school's scientific equipment, the method had been sufficiently subtle that its mechanism had escaped immediate detection, would have continued to escape detection, had not Miss Marple's observation of the toxicologist's preliminary findings prompted a reconsideration of the evidence, and had demonstrated how the advancement of Eleanor's symptoms had been entirely consistent with inhalation of poison rather than oral consumption. The remarkable efficiency of Charlotte's method, the careful planning that her crime had required, and the deliberate psychological motivation that had driven her toward murder, all of these elements had suggested that while Charlotte was certainly guilty of the act of murder, she was not simply a criminal, but rather a woman who had been transformed into a criminal through the prolonged application of psychological pressure by someone who had possessed considerable power over her fate. This observation had prompted Miss Marple to reflect, in a conversation that she had subsequently held with Inspector Bradshaw, upon the nature of responsibility and guilt in matters of criminal activity, upon the question of whether those who set in motion the psychological and emotional processes that ultimately lead to violence bore some share of responsibility for the violence that resulted. Inspector Bradshaw had been somewhat uncomfortable with these philosophical considerations, preferring to focus upon the concrete facts of the case and the legal responsibility that Charlotte bore for her actions, yet he had acknowledged that Miss Marple's observations contained a kind of truth that transcended the legal frameworks within which he was obliged to work. The arrest and subsequent prosecution of Charlotte Ames had proceeded with the efficiency that the English legal system demanded, and within a matter of weeks Charlotte had appeared before magistrate and subsequently before a full court, where she had been convicted of the murder of Eleanor Blackwood and sentenced to a term of imprisonment that would effectively constitute a life sentence given her current age and circumstances. The village of Little Mortham had gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms, the shock of the murder fading into the background as daily life reasserted itself with the kind of relentless normalcy that small communities possessed. Yet something had fundamentally altered in the social fabric of the village, a wariness and a recognition that the respectable and the ordinary concealed depths of human passion and resentment that could not be anticipated or entirely prevented through the maintenance of social convention. The aftermath of Charlotte's conviction had unfolded with the kind of quiet inevitability that characterized the conclusion of dramatic events in small villages, where the immediate sensation gradually gave way to more subdued reflection and the slow process of social reintegration that allowed communities to move forward despite the rupture that crime had introduced. Victoria Blackwood had remained in Little Mortham for several weeks following Eleanor's death, establishing herself in the modest cottage that Eleanor had bequeathed to her in her will, a gesture of affection that had been finalized in Eleanor's most recent testamentary revision and that had provided Victoria with both shelter and financial security independent of Eleanor's death. The village's attitude toward Victoria had undergone a remarkable transformation following the revelation of Charlotte's guilt, for the suspicion that had attached itself to Victoria so readily had been predicated upon assumptions regarding motive and opportunity rather than upon any genuine evidence of her involvement. With Charlotte's conviction, Victoria had been REI. Stated in the village's estimation, her previous misfortunes transformed into a kind of romantic tragedy, and she had found herself invited to social gatherings with a frequency and enthusiasm that suggested the village was attempting, through acts of social inclusion, to compensate for the suspicion it had so readily directed toward her. Rose Pemberton had also experienced a kind of rehabilitation of her reputation, for while the arsenic purchase had continued to suggest certain unfortunate tendencies in her character, she had been exonerated of any actual involvement in Eleanor's death, and the village had gradually accepted her presence without the undercurrent of suspicion that had characterized the days immediately following Eleanor's murder. The most significant aftermath, however, had involved the slow process of reconciliation and restoration that had occurred within Miss Marple's own understanding of the case, and her reflection upon its implications for her broader understanding of human nature and moral responsibility. She had sat in her parlor on a grey November afternoon, some 6 weeks following Charlotte's sentencing, reviewing her notes regarding the investigation and contemplating the various threads that had woven together to produce Eleanor's death. The case had ultimately resolved itself into a meditation upon the nature of betrayal and the psychological damage that could be inflicted by individuals of considerable power over those whom they had once favored but subsequently abandoned. Eleanor Blackwood had not been a malicious woman in any conscious sense, had not set out deliberately to harm the individuals who had benefited from her generosity and who had subsequently disappointed her, yet she had possessed the capacity to inflict considerable psychological damage through the casual withdrawal of her support and through her subsequent efforts to undermine the reputations and prospects of those who had fallen from her favor. Charlotte Ames had not been a naturally evil or criminally inclined individual, yet she had been transformed, through years of accumulated resentment and humiliation, into someone capable of calculating premeditation and of committing an act of murder that, while certainly criminal, had possessed a kind of logic that made it comprehensible within the context of her experience. The recognition of this complexity, this absence of simple categories of good and evil and the presence instead of a more nuanced spectrum of human behavior and motivation, had reinforced Miss Marple's fundamental belief in the necessity of careful observation and psychological understanding as the foundations upon which any genuine investigation must rest. She had received a visitor on that November afternoon, a visitor who had come at her invitation to discuss matters that extended beyond the official conclusion of the case. Victoria Blackwood had arrived with the kind of nervous courtesy that suggested she remained uncertain of her place within the village hierarchy despite her recent rehabilitation, and she had accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea with the careful politeness of someone still learning to trust in the sincerity of social gestures. During their conversation, Miss Marple had reflected upon the tragedy of Eleanor's death, not as a simple matter of crime and punishment, but as a manifestation of the human capacity for causing harm through the exercise of power over those who are vulnerable to its effects. She had explained to Victoria certain observations regarding Eleanor's character and her patterns of behavior, observations that suggested that Eleanor's withdrawal of support and her subsequent character assassination of Charlotte had not been unique, but rather had represented one instance of a pattern that Eleanor had repeated throughout her life. She had gently suggested to Victoria that while Eleanor had shown genuine affection toward her and had provided her with genuine support, Victoria should remain alert to the possibility that Eleanor's affection might, under certain circumstances, have transformed itself into something considerably less benign. The conversation had served the purpose of allowing Victoria to achieve a more complex and more accurate understanding of the woman who had been her benefactor, an understanding that placed Eleanor within a broader context of human imperfection and moral complexity, rather than within the simple categories of saint or villain that the village's more emotionally limited imagination might have constructed. As Victoria had departed, Miss Marple had settled herself once more with her knitting, the needles moving in their familiar rhythm as she contemplated the resolution of the case and the patterns that it revealed regarding the nature of small communities and the hidden depths of human motivation that existed beneath the surface of ordinary village life. The murder of Eleanor Blackwood had been solved, the guilty party had been identified and prosecuted, and the village had resumed its ordinary routines, yet the case had produced a permanent alteration in Miss Marple's understanding of Little Mortham and of the individuals who inhabited it. The case had demonstrated once again that the most significant crimes were not those perpetrated by obviously evil individuals or by obvious villains, but rather those that emerged from the interaction of human psychology, accumulated resentment, and the exercise of power by those who possessed it over those who remained vulnerable to its effects. The village of Little Mortham would continue, as villages always did, with its gossip and its social conventions, its marriages and its tragedies, its moments of kindness and its moments of casual cruelty, and Miss Marple would continue to observe it all with the quiet attention that had served her so well throughout her long life, understanding that within the small dramas of village life existed all the essential elements of human nature that composed the larger dramas of history and society.